Harper's Kennel Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.
Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
Welcome to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. My guest today is Douglas Woodward, a nationally recognized speaker and Bible author, also prophecy teacher. And today we're going to take an interesting look into the evil that is impacting and why it is doing so in this present day from what happened in the ages. And welcome to Crosspoint today, folks. Got an interesting book to look at, Descent into Evil, talking with Douglas Woodward. And we're talking about some things that sometimes people don't talk about. And they caught my eye. There was actually what caught my eye, Doug, was I was reading one of the Prophecy Watcher magazines, and you had a article in there called The Nazi Invasion of America. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I thought they already did that. And I got to reading, and it was about kind of the things they were up to a long time ago that we're seeing today. And anyway, especially when I seen that aircraft, I thought, now that looks like an interesting object that we hear a lot of talk about and we see in the air. So I thought that might be interesting to talk about how, you know, sometimes we know we're fighting the devil. We know that he's behind all of this kind of stuff. But, you know, we sometimes forget which direction, you know, these things come from and how they can be, like the word means, sinister. You know, it can be real sinister plans that we're not really catching on to. And I don't know how many Christians do or Americans really do. But let's look here at the first part of this book, because the way you've got the book laid out here, I mean, it's a pretty good-sized book. And in the table of contents, you've got it broken up to several, I think 10 different chapters. But then you break down those chapters several times in different ways and different parts of telling us about how all this happens. You know, then you're talking, well, here in the first book of this, you know, a lot of wartime intelligence, Nazi influence, psychological operations, and occult and paranormal stuff, and, of course, media manipulation, as always. How do you want somebody, when they pick this book up, you know, and they see this here, the Nazi invasion of America, after World War II and its continuing impact today, how does that affect us as Americans, as Christians?
Right. The book, I'm trying to tackle two big issues. One of those is, you know, the American foreign policy. Where are we and why are we doing the kinds of things that we're doing? And so to understand that, you go back really to pick up what was happening after World War II with the CIA and how the CIA began to, in effect, create America's foreign policy by various operations that it pulled in Eastern Europe, and then also, of course, invited in well over 100 German scientists in Project Paperclip. That was what brought Werner von Braun in and a number of his accomplices. And von Braun, of course, became the head of of NASA and the head of America's rocket program. Right, and so the cover of the book is meant to entice the person to want to see what's in there, and it has the Capitol, and it has 10, well, really about 9, I think, saucer-like objects floating across the sky. This happened in actually 2 successive weekends in 1952. It was called the Washington Flap, and there was never an understanding as to what caused it, but it was understood as a real event. It's fascinating in that Americans don't realize that there was already a major interaction between something other than, human intelligence that was, in effect, trying to create a new, I guess you could say, enemy of America, potentially. And there's a lot of possibilities as to what caused it. And I get into talking about the German Nazi continuation after World War II and their science that led to the creation of so-called flying saucers. And so we're dealing with that today. Of course, it's become a very big issue. Once again, we heard President Obama make a comment about, well, yes, aliens are real, but I haven't seen any of them. And then Trump came on and said, well, I can't tell you whether there are or there aren't aliens, but I can tell you that what he was saying was classified information, but he's not supposed to tell you anything.
Yeah.
So it continues to be an up-to-date issue, and what I try to do in the book is talk about what it means and how these two things are connected, and what the CIA was doing, and what was happening with flying saucers, starting in 1947 at Roswell, and then the 1952 event in Washington, D.C. So I'm tackling some very strange situations and things that Americans don't often know about the nature of our government and how we started doing the kinds of things that we did after World War II.
Yeah. Now, and then kind of jumping into Chapter 4, since you mentioned this UFO myth, we had a lot of disclassified information that got out so people could kind of see it. I don't know that we got to see everything. But anyway, this all kind of even goes with the psychological side of trying to get people's minds going in all these crazy different. I mean, in reality, we have a lot of people out there that are sometimes what I want to call ghost chasers. Some people that are out there that, there's a lot of theories that are not really real. And sometimes this causes those kind of people to run way too much with the story.
Right.
All of a sudden what is a little bit of thing here you're working with all of a sudden is magnified into, well, it's this theory and that theory, and then you get a lot of people coming up with stuff that's really hard to swallow, and then I think that's why some of the people just back off and don't want to hear any of it. But I believe this is all of a demonic nature, is it not? All what we're talking about, pretty much.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's predominantly when we're talking about the manifestation of flying saucers, the saucer, the orbs, the bright lights that often accompany this kinds of activity. This stuff is demonic, and it's probably too simple to say it's demonic. There's aspects of it. Some of this is a human manifestation. I believe that used to be what an old Christian scholar named Watchman Nee used to talk about in a book he had called The Latent Power of the Soul, meaning that human beings can also manifest spiritual things, and it can be connected with the demonic, or it can be simply a capability of our own nature, a nature that's pretty much latent or hidden. So you have that. You have a lot of experts, Jacques Vallée, who's been around forever, kind of the grandfather of UFO. A new person that's from the University of North Carolina, that is a religious professor, or professor of religion. Her name is Diane Pasulka, and she has written a couple of books that also talk about this phenomenon, and talk about it as a religious phenomenon. People that are seeking what I call the gospel of ET, that they refuse to believe in the God of the Bible, but instead they want to believe that there were ancient astronauts that came to Earth, or there are extraterrestrials that have been visiting us for virtually all of human history. They're proposing that those are sources for understanding the UFO phenomenon. There's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of different explanations that are coming out, and it does appear, based upon the fact that we've had scientists and military people under oath in Congress talking about this, that there really is something there. And now the question is there something that's real? The answer is yes, but then the real question is, well, what is it? And it has been the Christian view, since I first read a book about it back in John Walden and someone else put together a book back in the 80s, 1980s, that seems like, I think it's something like what on UFOs, what on earth is happening, or something along those lines. And it theorized that this was a demonic manifestation. And I think that, as a Bible-believing Christian, that's kind of still the position that we end up taking. And it may be unpopular, and it may be that the experts, like a Jacques Vallée or Diana Prosoka, may not really want to admit that it could be a demonic force that's manifesting and attempting to I guess you could say, deceive us, really. That's kind of where we find ourselves, and it's basically that we're poised for deception by these forces. And of course, believing that God isn't real, but that God was a spaceman, that obviously is not a biblical idea, although Eric Van Dyneken and a bunch of other folks have been talking about that for decades. And that got thrown up against the wall decades ago, and a lot of it stuck. Unfortunately, we still have that program on TV, basically History Channel, Ancient Astronauts. So that still is a very popular concept, and that's one that Christians have to be capable of explaining and defending the Bible as the real explanation for what's going on in the world with these so-called extraterrestrials and UFOs.
Now, here's what's really getting my attention through all this.
Okay.
We talk about communism. We talk about Nazism. Mm-hmm. Now, communism, if you notice, when people's been especially attacking ICE and other stuff like this, they're always calling them fascists, or they're calling them Nazis.
Yeah.
They don't so many times call them communist. They just use the word Nazi a lot. But when you start looking at this book like you've written, and you've got so much in-depth stuff in here, I mean in-depth stuff, folks, that you would just not believe some of the names that's tied to some of these things. And when you look at it, it almost looks like the Nazis were almost a occult type of people that were very paranormal and very satanic, because, I heard stories of Hitler being demon-possessed, of him sometimes foaming at the mouth when he'd get mad and carry on and stuff like that. So to me, the whole setup of Nazism, or whatever you call it, is really of a completely demonic nature. And just because we defeated Germany and put a stop to it, it did not stop its advancement of what it really wants to get accomplished. And a lot of times, I don't know that we're still realize that we are fighting this very same war. It's really never went away, in other words. It's just came to us at different directions. So am I catching on to this, or what?
Yeah, I think so. And, of course, what I'm trying to show in the book, the cover even is really a metaphor to sort of express this. If you conjecture that these flying saucers that were over Washington in 1952 were real, which I think the evidence is clear that they really were there. What they were is another question. But there's a lot of evidence that I put together that suggests that they might have been caused by a contingent of scientists that were still operating after World War II, and they were operating either in the South Pole, in Argentina, or somewhere else, perhaps in the North Pole area, and they were still continuing the development of their weapons. And we know that at the end of the war, World War II, that there were no less than 4 prototypes that were and had been developed by contractors to the Nazis. So this is in the 1942, 3, 4, 5 time frame. And that number of those prototypes may have actually done pilot flights. We know that there's a group called the Horton brothers that developed a flying wing, which is very much like our stealth aircraft. The B-2 looks like a flying wing, and these were the things that one of the earliest person that gave witness to flying saucers back in again about that same time frame, 1952. He said that he saw 9 flying wings near Mount Rainier in the area where I used to live for about 20 years, up in the Seattle area. That was one of the first major events of witnessing flying saucers that kind of became to public knowledge. It also, kind of fell on top of the Roswell incident in 1947 and other things that have gone on in this space. And so what I argue is that there is a good reason to believe that a lot of the activity in the war, in a time right after the war, could well have been German technology and could have been the scientists that were still acting, and that their activity is what was causing these things to occur. And so I use it as a metaphor to say whether or not that really was a German, not a flying saucer. Then I say, well, let's, looking at the picture, let's just think of it as a metaphor to suggest that German technology, German ideology, German fascism, if those things came to America after World War II and they were instituted in America in no small part by Allen Dulles and the CIA. And that gets into the deep discussion of what was really happening with the CIA in Europe in the early 1950s, and the fact that America was trying to supposedly protect Europeans from the threat of communism. And there's this thing that's a real good study of its own called Operation Gladio, which gets into this in detail, how after the war, the CIA key operator was a guy named Frank Wisner, who worked for Allen Dulles, and he was recruiting and bringing Nazis into these European operations, and they created what's called a leave-behind army, and they were hiring and bringing these Nazis. Many of them were ruthless killers, and they put them in villages around Europe, and they were there to so-called protect the people, and in fact, they created all kinds of havoc with the villages and towns in Europe, and it ended up being quite a mess. But that was the sort of beginning of the fact that the CIA was going to become the dominant operator. Most Americans don't know, really, the CIA was the operator behind the Vietnam War, and the CIA was involved at the very beginning and carried the war out for the first few years until the Pentagon finally got involved, but it was later on. Anyway, there's this connection between what the CIA was doing and what was happening with sort of the residue of the Germans from World War II. And so that, of course, as I said, impacted America directly, the bringing in of scientist Operation Paperclip, and then also many organizations were developed, run by individuals that had been positioned in the United States by Nazi companies. They're former American either distributors or subsidiaries. Those continued after the war in America even, and they were run by Nazi individuals. So but I'm just hitting really the highlights. This goes very, very deep, and I substantiate what I'm arguing by really several hundred citations of other research that's been done, writings by others, and so so that's where the book's coming from. That's why those objects are on the cover of the book, and what that really is trying to tell us about what was happening at this time and how it still impacts us today. The whole issue of fascism, we could talk more about what that really is, and the UFO awareness and growth in discussion. That's kind of where all this stuff springs from.
Well, folks, stay with us. A lot more right after this. This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. And welcome back to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. My guest today here on Crosspoint is Douglas Woodward. Douglas, we're talking about this book, Descent into Evil, but also you've got other stuff as well. Tell people how they can find out more about the book and the other work that you do as well.
Yeah, this is like the 20th or 21st, I lose count, book I've written over the years. And the books are all on theology, prophecy, history. I wrote a series of books on the history sort of the Bible, the meaning of the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that occurred about 200 to 300 years before Christ, and it ultimately became the basis of the early church for the first few hundred years, and it was the Bible that was quoted by the apostles and maybe even Jesus himself, because the Jews dispersed throughout the world in the so-called diaspora, they didn't speak Hebrew. Hebrew had become a lost language. They spoke Greek. And so that Bible became extremely influential in early Christian thought. And so I did quite a bit of research on that and talk about why the Septuagint ends up being the best witness for the messiahship of Jesus. And so there's a long story there, and I wrote really 3 books on that topic, believing that that's something that had really been overlooked by most Protestant theologians. So I thought that was something that needed to be exposed to the Christian public. And the feedback I've gotten on it has been fantastic. So I know I hit a nerve there. Yeah. So my books can be found pretty much on Amazon. They're also marketed by Prophecy Watchers. I still have other books in my head. So anyway, so you can find my stuff there. You can also find I have a YouTube channel. You can do a search on S. Douglas Woodward or Doug Woodward and find myself and my books out there. I've done over 100 interviews, and so most of those are actually captured and contained out on YouTube. And so there's plenty of ways to find me, and but Amazon is a good place to look for my books, as well as Prophecy Watchers.
Okay, so back to the book here, chapter 3, talking about, you mentioned something called, you mentioned intelligence services. We were talking about them before, but you talk about supernatural warfare. Now, I've heard of spiritual warfare, but you get to talking about supernatural warfare. So here's another part of the book again now. So on down here in the book, I'm looking at page 117, there's a big deal about Scientology. And so when you start putting that together and you start mentioning the name supernatural warfare, is that where they brought in these false, fake religions to try to get these people to have something that they establish a reasoning that they can get this on down and get other people to join it, because they're not joining the Nazi Party, they're joining a group like Scientology or something, but really in the background it's part of that. How does that work? How does that work?
Yes, I mean there's several different sort of threads, you could say, that are related to the supernatural, particularly in intelligence, and the supernatural as it relates very strongly in the UFO discussion. So on the standpoint of intelligence, there was a phenomenon that is called remote viewing, and it is a activity that CIA engaged in beginning in depth in the 1970s and carried on for, I still think it carries on today, but it certainly was carried on even into the 90s, although that's denied officially. Of course, the government never tells us anything that's not true. And of course, I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek. So the idea of remote viewing was that these individuals, the way that the process worked, and it did work, these individuals, there's only a handful that were really very effective at it, although the Army maintained a crew of probably a dozen or more people that various agencies, primarily Defense and the CIA, came to do some poking around in what was, where somebody was in the world, what was going on at a particular communist base. And so these individuals could actually be given just a geographical coordinate, and they could tell you what was happening at that location. And so I outlined quite a number of stories, individuals like Joe McMoneagle, Uri Geller, Pat Price, and a bunch of others that were involved in this. And the stories are quite fascinating. There are a lot of books that have been written about it. So this is the key to the supernatural weapons of war that the Defense Department and the CIA began to use this to be able to identify. If a general, for instance, there was a time where a general was kidnapped, and the remote viewers were able to identify ultimately where that general was, and he was able to be rescued. There was another time where a Russian jet was downed in like in the Congo, let's say in Africa, and the remote viewers were asked by the Carter administration to find that jet, and they did. They basically said it's within about a 1 mile radius of a certain point, and sure enough, that's where it was. And so they were calling upon some kind of power. The question was that demonic power, or was it, like I talked about earlier, the latent power of the soul? Some individuals seem to have extraordinary capabilities. Watchman Nee argued that God created us with these capabilities, but he intentionally made them latent, made them hide or hidden within human nature because they were just too powerful. And, the thought was, well, sinful creatures can't possibly handle that kind of skill. And so they were given to Adam to help him take care of the world, to be his gardener. But there are capabilities that today and through time have kind of bubbled out only into a few individuals. And so the Army in the 1970s searched for these individuals that could do remote viewing, and they did that successfully for a long time. And as I said, there's reasons to believe that program still continues even today.
Well, folks, this is a lot of good information. I hope that you check into this more. We're going to be back with a little bit more right after this.
Sharing your faith can be as easy as sharing your favorite radio station.
There's no greater way to share the gospel, to reach as many people as possible than through Christian radio.
Tell your friends where they can experience hope.
It's always pointed to Christ.
91.7 The Word.
And we're at Cross Point. Thanks for joining us today. And folks, I've got with me here on Cross Point, Douglas Woodward. We're talking about Descent into Evil. Again, Douglas, would you tell people how they can find out more about your book?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you can find me on Amazon. Just do a search on S. Stephen Douglas Woodward, and you'll find my books out there. There is an author page that's hard to find, but it is out there on Amazon. Then I also have a YouTube channel that a lot of the interviews that I've done of others, as well as at least 100 interviews that I've done that have been recorded and placed on YouTube. So you'll find me in those locations. You'll also find my books at Prophecy Watchers, and there's a lot that I've written for the magazine extensively in times past. I know those guys, Gary Stearman and Mondo and Bob Ulrich, and so I've been associated with that ministry really for, since 2012, I'd say, so almost 15 years. So you'll find my books at Prophecy Watchers if you want to support their ministry, and mine directly from them.
All right. Chapter 6 here in the book's another spot that caught my attention. Here you talk about strange bedfellows. You talk about Nazis and Freemasons. There's even a mention of fascism, I think, somewhere in here. Can you kind of tell us how these connect? I mean, a lot of people heard of the Freemasons.
Right.
This is an area that gets an argument started sometimes among people because they're part of that and others aren't, and there can be issues. But tell us what you see here.
Yeah. Well, going back even into Germany with Hitler back before the war began, you've always had a hatred between the communists and the Nazis, between the fascists and the socialists. And so that really was what caused the brown shirts back in Germany after World War I. And so you've had that kind of war between those two ideologies. And even today, you see that battle on the streets of Minneapolis, where I live in that area. And there's those that are ICE is called fascist. It's essentially authoritarian. The people that complain about it would say, well, it's unlawful. And then you have the most vocal individuals are likely Marxist communists. And they believe that the U.S. government should be moved into socialist. And so we've actually seen a socialist, probably Marxist, elected mayor in New York City. Now, if that doesn't send chills up your spine, you're just not paying attention. So that is, indicating that that battle between fascism and communism is still continuing in our land. Now, I argue that fascism itself, really the German ideology did impact and has impacted America. And I go through a number of things in this chapters that talk about the CIA and its exploitation of technologies, things that were done by Germany during the war, prior to the war, during the war, and those things were documented, have been documented well in a variety of books. Certainly, a fairly recent book on Sidney Gottlieb, who was the Army's number one chemist, basically, and a book by Stephen Kinzer called "The Poisoner in." I guess Poisoner in Chief, because what it is. He was like the chemical czar of the Army, creating various kinds of potions, primarily applying LSD to individuals. One who likely he was responsible for making jump out the window of from the 10th story of a New York City hotel. That became the center of a big article by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, and ultimately decided a lawsuit in favor of the plaintiff, which was the son of this individual that was killed. And so, again, this battle between fascism and socialism has been a theme throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. And that theme, as I said, it lives today, so it still has an impact in the United States, very much so today.
Again, I'm looking here kind of like it, and you mentioned in here about the bottom line and stuff. You don't say the descent into evil argues that the United States won World War II, but something was lost vital in the aftermath. So what was that was lost?
What we should understand is this fellow named Allen Dulles. If you fly into Dulles International Airport outside of Washington, D.C., you might wander through, as I have, the central hall of that airport. You're going to see a bust of Allen Dulles. Well, Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA beginning in 1952. He had a brother named John Foster Dulles, who was basically the Secretary of State for Eisenhower. And so he and his brother Alan were in charge of foreign policy in the 1950s. And so Dulles was instrumental in creating and bringing in these various technologies through the paperclip thing, as well as things that we've talked about, some of the supernatural things that were originally developed by the Nazis prior to the end of World War II. And so I get into quite a few of those things in the book, and they're all evil, and the United States began to practice these things, and America likes to believe that we don't torture, but the reality is that we do torture, and so these capabilities and practices were put in place by Sidney Gottlieb under the authority of the CIA, because he was CIA, and so you had this stuff going on in spades after the war, and so this was what was happening. The intrusion of the Nazis at that time, and then that work spread throughout the CIA, and eventually, the CIA was the foreign policy arm, maybe by accidentally, but it was the policy arm, and it was overwhelming what the president would do and what the Congress would do. So it was ultimately becoming what we call today the deep state. That deep state was basically architected and put in place predominantly by Allen Dulles. And so now he came to his end in the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and this has implications all the way through the Kennedy assassination. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an invasion by former Cuban immigrants as they're called, going back into Cuba, attempting to throw up or overthrow Castro, and it was very unsuccessful. There's a lot of controversy about what happened, but the short part of the short story is that Eisenhower had approved it when Eisenhower had told Dulles not to do anything like that. When Kennedy came in, that Kennedy shouldn't have to bear the responsibility for these operational exploits like the Bay of Pigs. Well, of course, Allen Dulles didn't agree, and he went ahead and made it happen. And so Kennedy became so frustrated with the CIA, he said, "I need to, break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and let it fly away in the wind." So that's something that Kennedy said. And, of course, what did that set up? Well, it set up the planning for the elimination of that president. There's a lot I go into in terms of what was objectionable about the president, but a lot of it had to do with his willingness to talk with and work with Khrushchev as the premier of the Soviet Union, and willing to talk about going to space in the 1960s to go to the moon together. And behind the scenes, this may be something that people will find hard to believe, but Kennedy and prior to him, Eisenhower, they knew all about UFOs. They knew about flying saucers. They knew what was going on. And this was part of the thing that was also to be shared between the United States and the Soviet Union. And to cap it all off, Kennedy, because he was shaken so much by the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, Kennedy wanted to put an end to all of our nuclear weapons. And Khrushchev was going to join him in that, and that ultimately got both of them thrown out of office. Kennedy was thrown out by being assassinated. These aren't the only things that caused Kennedy to get crosswise with the administration, but they were clearly part of it. The CIA had set up a hit squad for the Castro assassination, composed of sharpshooters from the mafia, essentially. And there's a really good documentary out there on the mafia killers that were assembled take out Castro. Well, it turns out that they happened to be available, and this was who actually killed Kennedy, was a contingent of individuals that were sort of masterminded by the CIA, but executed by the mafia. And so that's the heart of the story. And so ultimately, this shows yet again another connection between the space activity, extraterrestrials, flying saucers, and the German contingent. We have to remember that Wernher von Braun, who ran NASA, was in fact a SS officer. He was very instrumental in the building of all the so-called wonder weapons, including the V1, the buzz bomb, and then the V2, the giant ballistic missile. In fact, it was von Braun that originally created the first ballistic missile. And, we hear about ballistic missiles right now every day, don't we? With Iran launching ballistic missiles against Israel and against its neighbors and against U.S. Assets in the Middle East. But it was von Braun that developed that during the war on the Baltic Sea at his manufacturing plant, Peenemünde. And so this is yet another area where German influence had a big influence on the United States and ultimately led to the assassination of Kennedy and unfortunately, probably a failed attempt on taking Castro's life.
Before we go, it just seems to me that probably it's Christianity that keeps getting in their way, because that's something else they need to get out of the way. You see this big threat we have today of Islam trying to come in and really overpower our government. And I mean, if you look at, the city you live in, the area, Idaho's got some issues out there, Michigan, New York, of course, and Texas now has got to fight with them. And it seems like it always boils down to the good and the bad. It's Christianity versus somebody trying to do good in that. But Christianity is a real threat to all of this, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, of course, what I'm trying to do with the book is awaken Christians to one of the root causes to these conflicts today. And, the point was, these things began primarily right after World War II, and they have trickled down and influenced things, for the next, almost 80 years afterwards. And so I want Christians to be aware of these things so that they'll be more engaged in attempting to bring Christ back into our government and to eradicate the enemies of Christianity. That's really what I'm trying to do with writing this book.
Well, and again, Descent into Evil is the title of this book. Tell people, again, how they can get a copy of it or find out more about your work.
Yes, please. You can get a copy of Descent into Evil on Amazon. I've actually just released a second edition. I updated the book with quite a bit of information that has come into my awareness over the last 8 months. So I felt I had to go ahead and create a second edition. So it is out there now. It also has a lot more charts and quite a few cartoons as well, based upon input I did with artificial intelligence in drafting and affect some drawings to bring a little bit of levity to some very serious subjects. And so you can find me on Amazon. You can also find me on YouTube. And I do have a channel on YouTube where I have lots of interviews that I've done. So you can find me in both of those places. And Prophecy Watchers would be another place to keep in mind where they carry my books.
Well, again, Douglas, thanks so much for being with us today on Crosspoint.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure, and good to talk to folks in the show again.
Yeah, good to have you with us. Well, an interesting interview for sure today here on Crosspoint, folks. And there is evil all around us, and it comes in many different forms. We do need to remember that. Folks, know your Bible. Learn stuff from these books like we're talking about today, but also know about the other book in my other hand, the Bible, the Holy Word of God. It's inspired words of God. It's words you need to know. They're never outdated. It contains certainly the most important words you're ever going to read and certainly ever follow. Be sure and join us again next time as we can discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week. Allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count in God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week: Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.